Masechet Nazir Daf Kaf Aleph. We began the fourth perek with the new Mishnah that starts off with the case. Someone says Hadeni Nazir, and then Mr. B says me too, and Mr. C says me too. And we're going to start off with the question: with how long do they have to wait? Do they have to say it immediately, or can they say it a few minutes later? So Yetev Resh Lakish kamed Rabbi Yehuda Nesi'ah v'Yetev ka'amar v'hu she'tpisu kulan betoch kedei dibur. So Resh Lakish was sitting before Rabbi Yehuda Nesi'ah. This is not Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but rather the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he was teaching and saying that he was teaching this very Mishnah, and he's saying that's only if he links to the previous person within the amount of time that you can say a short phrase, which we'll see what that is in a second. V'kama tok kedei dibur kedei shelat shalom, v'kama shelat shalom kedei she'omer shalom tamid lerav. Within the time for speaking means to give a greeting. And how much is it time? How long is the time to give a greeting that a student would give to his teacher? What would he say? He would say Shalom Alecha Rabbi. Okay, that's only a couple of seconds. So when the first person says Hadeni Nazir, the second person who hears it has to say within just a couple of seconds Va'ani. If he waits a few minutes, they're already on to something else. All of his senses Va'ani is completely out of context. It's not clear that it's referring to the first one. But rather has to be really almost immediate. It's kind of like a continuation of that person's statement. Saying me too. Okay, so that is what Resh Lakish said in front of his teacher. However, Amar le tub la shabak Ravcha letalmida. But Rabbi Yehuda Nesi'ah responded to him and said, you left no room for a student. In other words, if a student goes and he sees his teacher, right, and he says, Shalom Alecha Rabbi, and in the meantime, at the same time, someone had just said, Hadeni Nazir, and he wants to say, me too. So he says, by the time he says hello, he already missed his opportunity. In other words, this is too short. You can't just give someone such a short window of opportunity. Rather, it should be something longer. How much longer? It could be different. There's different opinions about that. Maybe it should be while you're still involved in that conversation. And so it's clear, oh, you're going to be a Nazir? Tell me why. What are you going to do? Oh, you know what? Va'ani. So maybe you should have a few more minutes within a certain context. Okay, but anyway, Resh Lakish did teach that it has to be within the amount of time to say a greeting, and we're going to support his opinion. Tanya namehachi mishamar harini nazir v'shama chavero v'shakede dibur v'amar va'ani hu asur v'chavero mutar v'kama kede dibur kede shelat shalom tamid larav. One person, Mr. A, says Hadeni Nazir, and then his friend, Mr. B, hears it, and he waits long enough that someone could, long enough to speak. He waits longer than that. And only after that he says, oh yeah, Va'ani, me too. So the first person, Mr. A, is prohibited, and Mr. B is permitted, is not a Nazir. How long is kedei dibur? Enough time for a student to give a greeting to his teacher. So you see, it's exactly the same thing. It has to be within that short time period, and leaving a little bit after that is already outside the window of opportunity. Let's bring yet another proof, at least try. This one is from our Mishnah, where it says, it gives an example of three people. A person A said, I'm a Nazir, and then person B said, Va'ani, and then Mr. C said, also Va'ani. And that's all. It only gives an example of two people that are linking to the first one, and not four, not five. Tana. So this is a proof because it shows that it has to be within a short time period. How many people can say Va'ani within the time it says to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi? Right, Shalom Alecha. It's only a few syllables, only a couple of seconds. So only two people would say Va'ani. Va'ani is actually three syllables each. So it's about the same amount of time, and that's why the Mishnah is precise and says only two people. From the time Mr. A says Hadeni Nazir, you have only a window of opportunity of 2 seconds. And therefore, how many people can say Va'ani within 2 seconds? 2 people. And that's it. And that's why the Mishnah says 2 and not 3. So this seems to be a proof for Resh Lakish. But we reject that. Tana kiruchla lichshiv elezil. What? The Tana, the author of the Mishnah, the reciter of the Mishnah, should be like a peddler who continues on and on, repeating himself and continuing. A peddler, someone, he's selling in the street, keeps saying, two apples for $1, 2 apples for $1. He keeps repeating himself on and on. So what? You want the reciter of the Mishnah to keep saying, Hadeni Nazir, Shema Chaveron says Vani, Shema Chaveron says Vani. How long you want him to go? 10, 20? When are you going to stop? So he's giving 2 examples. That's enough, right? Three people altogether, 2 people that are linking to it, and you can figure out the rest. So the Mishnah is written in short form, and you can't prove from the Mishnah that necessarily that only 2 people have a chance to say Va'ani. But then we reject that and say, if the Mishnah is really going to be in such short form, so just say 1. Only 2 people altogether. Mr. A says Hadeni Nazir. 1 person says Va'ani. And then I could figure out the rest. That if another person says Va'ani also, and so on, they also will be Nazirim. So if you want to be shorthanded, fine, just say only 1 example, 1 va'ani and not 2 va'anis. And the answer to that is hachename mishum de katani sefa hutar rishon hutru kolan hutar acharon mutar becholan asurin bekladika emsai mishum hachi katani va'ani. Says you're right. If it was only the first clause, if we just needed to teach that Mr. Isa Sarei Nazir, the word va'ani is binding, even though he doesn't have to say Va'ani also I'm a Nazir. He could just say that word Va'ani, and that is like ditto, and it quotes the first. If that was the only halacha we wanted to teach, then you're right. In fact, the Mishnah would only mention 1 Va'ani. But here, the Sefa, the next case of the Mishnah, wants to teach something about the linking and renouncing, because in the rest of the Mishnah teaches that if the first person, Mr. A, undid his Nizirut, then all of them are also annulled because B and C depend on A. Whereas if C annulled his only, then only C is annulled, and A and B do not depend on C. They came earlier, and those are prohibited, remain prohibited. So you see, since it's talking about the first person and the last person, we can infer that there is a middle person. So we need 3 people in order to have the example of the last Mishnah, so you can have a first, a middle, and a last, and that's why in the Resha it also has 3 people, A, B, and C, so you could have a first, middle, and last. Okay, but we cannot prove one way or another from this Mishnah whether how long the time period is for someone to say Va'ani. Now, question: when you have 3 or more people, is it a chain link that each person depends on the one immediately previous to him? So A says Harei Nazir, B links to A. When C says Va'ani, C is linking to B. Is that way it works? Or is everyone linking to A, right? B says Va'ani, links to A. C links to A, says Va'ani, it's linking directly to A. So is it like a chain link or more like kind of spokes where A is the middle and everybody is connecting directly to A? What would be a practical difference between them? To link and continue linking. Here's the 2 sides. If you say it's a chain link, well then you can go on forever, because the first one says Hadeni Nazir. Within 2 seconds, B says Va'ani. Within another 2 seconds, C says Va'ani. Within 2 seconds after C saying Va'ani, D can say Va'ani. So therefore, if you have a lot of people, you can, in a line, you can keep going on forever, because it's not 2 seconds from Mr. A, it's 2 seconds from the previous, since D is linking to C and E is linking to D. Whereas v'yamat bekama mitpisi tefe mikadei dibur la mitpisin mai. Whereas if you say that everybody is linking only to Mr. A, well then once B says va'ani and then C says va'ani, already 2 seconds has passed, and there's no time for D, E, F or anyone else. That would be the maximum, unless they said it unanimously, right? You have a group and they all say va'ani at the same time. But we're not talking about that. If they're saying it one at a time, then the 2 would be the maximum. So you see how this question is related to what came before, because in the attempted proof earlier from the Mishnah, we were assuming that they're all linking directly to A, and that's why I said maximum 2. We rejected that proof from the Mishnah anyway, but now we're bringing up the more general question: which way does it go? Tashema hareni Nazir v'shama chavero v'amar va'ani ותולה מידי, שמע מינה בכמה הוא דמתפסה, דיסל כדעת אחד בחברי מתפיס, לתנה טובה ואני. So the first one is from our Mishnah, this is similar logic that we just talked about at the top of the page. The Mishnah begins, Mr. A says Hareni Nazir, and then B says Va'ani, and then C says Va'ani, and that's it. It doesn't say D, E, and F. So we can learn from that this is the maximum because they're all linking to the first. It's like spokes. Because if you would say that it's like a chain link, then you could go on forever and say Va'ani many more times. So that's a proof from the Mishnah that it's like spokes. And then we answer as we did before, what? Author of the Mishnah, the reciter, is like a peddler? Just go on forever repeating the same thing? No, it's just giving a couple of examples, and that is sufficient. Okay, and then we say, Velitni had. In that case, why do you even need 2 examples? Just say 1. You want to teach me the principle that Va'ani causes a link. So, Velishmin and Kulehu, say 1 time, and I'll figure out the rest that you can do it many times in a link and go on. I did the Katani Hutar Rishon, Hutar Kulan, Hutar Acharon, Acharon Mutav Kulan Asurin, Miklal Dikam Sa'i, Mishum Hachi, Katani, Va'ani. So same explanation as before above. It's because the continuation of the Mishnah talks about a case where Mr. A renounced his vow, and then in that case everybody is renounced. That's for sure true, because everybody at some point is dependent on A directly or indirectly. Whereas the last guy undoes his, renounces, then only the last guy, only C is permitted and everybody else is prohibited, remains prohibited. So since it talks about the first and the last, that means that there must be someone in the middle. And that's why it set up the case at first that there's 3 people altogether, so that we can understand the very next case. But you're right, otherwise if we just wanted to know that Va'ani works, then that would be sufficient to have just 1. Very good. Tashema hutar harishon huteru kulan. Rishon hu desharu ha'emsa'i la shema mina bekama mitpesin. All right. Second proof says that if Mr. A renounced his vow, then all of them are renounced. So we can infer from that only if Mr. A voided his vow, then B and C are permitted. But if the middle one renounced his vow, then that would not be true. Then the middle one only would be undone, whereas C would continue. So we can learn from there that bekama mitpesin, that B and C are dependent directly on A, like spokes. Otherwise, it would have said not just if A annuls his vow, then B and C. You would even should have said that if B annuls his vow, then also everyone after that, C would renounce his vow. Since it doesn't talk about B, but only A, that shows that it's like spokes. So that's the attempted proof. However, emalach, no, I can say, argue the other way. The olam had bechavre matpis. Maybe it's actually like a chain link. Now, because the Mishnah wanted to give an example when all 3 of them are permitted, that's why it gave that case. Because that if Mr. A renounces, then all of them are renounced. Because if it would say Mr. B then Mr. C would be renounced, but Mr. A would not be voided. So if it talked about the emsa'i, then the first one wouldn't, and that's why it talked about the first one renouncing. But it was not to exclude the possibility of B renouncing. And it wouldn't, if B renounced, in fact, it would be a chain link, and C also would be undone. So we can't bring a proof from either way from that clause. All right, let's try the next part, the next law in that very clause. Tashema hutar acharon ha'acharon mutar v'kolan asurin dela'ika acharina batre. Okay, the Mishnah taught that if C annuls his vow, then only C is permitted and A and B are still prohibited because there is nobody after C. So he's the last one. So what can we infer from that? But B, if B annuls, then there is someone after him, and that would be, and C would be annulled also. So here we can learn that it's actually a chain link, right? Since the only case where one person is annulled is when C is annulled. That's why he gave that case of acharon. That means if only B annuls, then it wouldn't be that only B is out, because the Mishnah could have taught that case instead and said, if B annuls, only B. And then certainly I would have known that if C annuls, only C is out. So the Mishnah must be hinting that the only way to get one person out is only if the last one does. But if B would be out, then B and C would be permitted. So is that a good proof that it's a chain link? And we say not necessarily. Le'olam emalach bekama mitpesin. Umay acharon dekatani emsa'i ve'aidet etana rishon tena acharon. Maybe in fact it's like spokes, and all of them are directly dependent on A. And then when it says the last doesn't necessarily mean only C. It can even be referring to B. But since in the beginning of the Mishnah it talked about rishon, meaning the first, that's for sure A. So then anybody after A is called a later person. Acharon doesn't have to be the last. It can be later than A. And so really either if B or C annulled their nizirut, then only B or C would be annulled, and because it's not necessarily like a chain link, and so there is no proof from here. All right, and now third attempted proof. Tashema detanya behedya hutar harishon hutru kulan hutar acharon ha'acharon mutar ve'kulan asurin. Mutar emsa'i hemenu ulmata mutar hemenu ulmala asur shema'mina had bechavre mitpis shema'mina. Oh, in the end we actually have a beraita that says this explicitly. You should have brought the beraita in the first place, but we wanted to go through that exercise to see that the Mishnah is ambiguous about it. Then could be read both ways. Here's the beraita. It says if A annulled his vow, then all of them are annulled. That's for sure, no matter what. If the last person annulled his vow, then only the last person is permitted and the rest are still prohibited. Hutar emsa'i, this is the case we've been looking for that the Mishnah didn't say. If B annuls his vow, then from him and onward are permitted, in other words B and C, whereas from there and upward A is still prohibited. And so we see conclusively that each one is a link to the one before, and that is a clear proof. In fact, this was the easier way of reading the Mishnah, because Mishnah did say acharon, and acharon does sound like last, not a later one. So it was a difficult reading in the Mishnah anyway, but not absolute proof. But this baraita is, in fact, absolute proof. Okay, now the next clause in the Mishnah says, Hareni Nazir v'shama chavero, ve'amar pi kefiv us'ari kis'aro. Is one person says Hareni Nazir, and the second person doesn't say Va'ani, but says a more unusual phrase, my mouth is like his mouth, my hair is like his hair. Well, that makes him a Nazir also. Now we're going to ask exactly how does this work. Mishum damar pi kefiv us'ari kisaro hareni Nazir. Why should that be so? Right? Maybe it just means that I want to get a hairdo like that person. Right? I mean, how do we know that means specifically Nazirut? Urminhu, and we have a challenge here. Yadi nezira, veragli nezira, lo amar kelum, roshi nezira, kebedi nezira, har zehreze nazir. You look at this baraita where someone says, my hand is a nazir, my leg is a nazir. He said nothing. He's not a nazir. Whereas if he said, my head is a nazir, my liver is a nazir, then he in fact is a nazir. Oh, what's the difference between saying hand and head? Something that one's life is dependent upon it, an essential organ, which you need a head to live. You also need a liver to live, but you don't need a hand and a foot to live. So only if you talked about an essential organ, then is a nazir. It's the same as saying, I am a nazir. If you say my heart, my head, right, anything that you need, since you need that, it's an essential part of you, then the entire person is in fact a nazir. Okay, so this is all a challenge because in the Mishnah, he only talked about mouth and hair. So, well, maybe I guess you need a mouth to live. But hair, you don't need hair to live. So why should hair make someone a nazir? And the answer is, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Hachi, Ye'aseh pi kepiv miyayin, usari kisaro milagoz. No, mouth and hair are specific descriptors of a nazir. He's saying, may my mouth be like his mouth in refraining from wine. May my hair be like his hair in that it will grow and I will not cut it. So those two specific things, because they are particular to the activity of a nazir, those work. But other parts of the body that are not essential organs, then the nazirut would not work for those. Okay, good. Hareni nezira v'shama ba'alav amar va'ani eno yachol lehafer. Next case in Mishnah was about a woman says, I am a nezira. And then the husband heard that and said, va'ani, I also want to be a nazir. So he is a nazir. She's a nezira too. And furthermore, he cannot thereafter annul her vow. Usually a husband can annul the vows of his wife, including Nazirut, but now that he did that, he cannot anymore. All right, we're going to analyze this. Baal mi'akad akad or dilma megaz gaiz. When a husband annuls the Nazirut of his wife, is it uprooting it from the beginning, or is it severing it from now on, but she was in fact a Nazir until that point? Maybe he didn't hear about her Nazirut until a few days later. He was away on a trip. And so this is the question. We already discussed this on the previous stuff, but now we're going to go into it in depth, and we're going to see about 6 proofs. We'll see 3 of them today. So first we ask, what would be a practical difference between these 2 opinions? Here's one. If a woman says, I am a nazira, and then her friend said, va'ani. Okay, so that works just like it usually does. But subsequently, the husband of Mrs. A heard about that and annulled her Nazirut vow. Now, if you say that annulment is retroactive, in that case, that Mrs. B's Nazirut also is annulled because Mrs. B depended on Mrs. A. And now that Mrs. A is annulled retroactively from the start, so Mrs. B links to nothing. And so she's in the clear. Whereas if you say that when the husband annuls, it's from that time on, let's say the 10th day, and from then on, but she was a Nazira on the day that she says, I am a Nazir, in that case, even though Mrs. A is annulled and she is not a Nazira anymore, but Mrs. B, who links to A, still continues to be a Nazira because she linked to A when A was in fact a Nazira. All right, so this is going to make a big practical difference. Now, what's the answer? All right, attempted proof number 1. Tashema. Hareni Nazira v'shama ba'ala v'amar va'ani eno yachol lehafer. A proof is from the Mishnah itself. When she says, I'm a Nazira, and the husband says, me too, he cannot annul it. Now let's see why. Visal kadatech ba'al megazgayiz lefer leishto vehu litasar ela lav shmamina ba'al mi'akar akar. Just as background, there's a general principle that a person cannot annul his own vow. You have to go to a sage, to someone else. You can't annul your own nizirut. Okay, so with that in mind, here's how it works. This Mishnah that says a husband cannot annul his wife's vow, if when he said he's the one that said va'ani and linked to her vow. Well, what is the reason? If you say that the husband annuls it from now on, so that, let's say, a case where she said I'm a nazira in the morning and he said va'ani immediately. In the afternoon, he says no, I don't want my wife to be a nazira, and he annuls it. So fine, he can just annul it, and he will remain a nazir, because at the time, since it's only from then on, at the time when she made a nazirut, she was a nazir, so his vow sticks, and so there would actually be no problem for a husband to annul her and remain a nazir. And so therefore there's no reason for the Mishnah to say he cannot. He should be able to annul it. Whereas if you say the husband retroactively annuls her vow, then we would explain why he cannot nullify it in this case. The problem is, if he, in the afternoon, decides to annul her nizirut, it will work retroactively. Turns out she was never a nizira, and therefore his nizirut, which links to hers, would also be undone. But that it goes against the rule that a person cannot annul his own vow. And so that would make sense. That's why he cannot annul her vow, because he cannot cause his own vow to be annulled. So this part of the Mishnah is a proof that the annulment goes back retroactively. Right? Isn't that a good proof? Lo le'olam megaz gayiz ubedinu de lefer la v'aynu tamad la maseh mefer kevan damar la va'ani keman damar kayam li chidame imichil hakamato maseh mefer v'ila la maseh mefer. No, in fact, we can explain this Mishnah that according to the opinion that it's only annulled from the time of annulment and on her nazirut, but she was a nazir before that. And you're right, really, from the letter of the law, he would be able to annul it from then on, since it's from then on, so it wouldn't be a problem. But rather, the reason why he cannot, the Mishnah says he cannot annul it, even though it's only happening from now on, and he would remain a nazir. So that's not a problem of his annulling his own vow. He would not be annulling his own vow, but rather the problem here is that because he said va'ani to her nizirut, that's the same as ratifying it and saying, I want to uphold this vow for you. Therefore, the only way he can annul is if he would go to a sage and said, I want to annul my ratification. And after he annuls his ratification, then he can annul her vow. But if not, he cannot. Right? So va'ani implies, me too, means I'm glad that you're a nazira, and I want to be a nazir too. That's the reason, but we cannot derive from this part of the Mishnah one way or another. All right, so next attempted proof, Tashema. Haisha shenadra benazir, v'ifrisha et behemta, ve'achar kach hefer la ba'ala, im shelo hayta behema teseh v'tir'ai ba'ayadir, v'im shelo hayta behema hachata tamut. A woman declares herself to be a nazira, and she already separates an animal, says, this is going to be my animal, I'm going to bring it for one of the three animals that she brings, the korban chatat. She's going to bring this for the korban chatat that she will have to bring at the end of the nizirut. However, after that, the husband annuls her nizirut. So this Mishnah, this is a Mishnah that we are going to see soon. If the animal belongs to the husband, well, in that case, just let it out, let it go and graze in the flock, and it's not consecrated. Since it wasn't hers, that's a general rule. If someone consecrates something that was not theirs, and they didn't need to, so that means they didn't have a right to, so then the animal just goes. I mean, if she did need to, so then her husband would have to provide it, and therefore it would be consecrated. But in this case, since it turns out retroactively that she didn't have to because she was never a Nazirah, that's fine. Whereas if it belongs to her, this is something that she inherited, or he made a stipulation: you keep this. This is yours. Then the chatat has to be put into isolation and be allowed to die, and that is the general rule of a chatat offering. For example, if the owner died, and now you can't bring it. No one else can bring it. The owner can't bring it, but it's consecrated, so you have to let it die. So that's the rule here. Now let's analyze. Hold on. If the husband's annulment goes retroactively and undoes the whole thing, well, even if it's hers, then let it go and be a regular cholin animal, just like if it's the husband's animal, since she was never a Nazirah. Therefore, her consecration was not a consecration. She had no obligation at that point. And you remember, there's a general rule: you can't just bring a korban chatat because you feel like. There's no such thing as a voluntary korban chatat. Since she was not liable for a korban chatat, so let it go. Rather, we can learn from here that it's severed. The husband severs the obligation from that point and on. So it turns out she was, in fact, a Nazirah at the time that she consecrated the animal. That's why, if it belongs to the husband, even though she was a Nazirah at the time, but now she doesn't have to bring it anymore, so then it goes back to Chulin, because it was never hers. But if it belongs to her, then the Korban, she was a Nazirah, she was liable at the time, and therefore it has to go ahead and die. So actually this is a good proof that that's Megaz Gaiz is from then on. Isn't that a good proof? No, not necessarily. Le'olam emalach ba'al me'akar akar. V'hainu tama kevan de la sericha kapara havat kechatat shemetu be'aleha ugmidi de chatat shemetu be'aleha tamut. No, really could be that it is in fact retroactive. And she never was in the Nazirah, turns out. But nevertheless, the animal is consecrated because she no longer needs atonement. But at the time that she made the consecration, she was a Nazirah. Just now, retroactively, she's no longer a Nazirah. She doesn't need atonement. So this is similar to a case of a person who went alive and needed to bring Korban Chatat. And so he designated animal, and then that owner dies. Nevertheless, even though there's no owner and there's nobody that needs atonement, we know that the law is that the animal has to be left to die. And so this woman is kind of like the same thing. She's not dead, but she was a Nazirah. Now all of a sudden she's no longer a Nazirah. It's like she vanished. She physically is there, but her Nazirut vanished. Nevertheless, just like if a person dies, then the consecration is still consecration. So too here, even if it retroactively is undone, the consecration is still a consecration, and if she owns it, then that will still be a problem. All right, last attempted proof for today. Tashema. האישה שנדרה בנזיר, והייתה שותה יין ומטמאה למתים, הרי זו סופגת את 40. This is Mishnah, a couple of adaptim from now. A woman becomes a Nazir, and she drank wine, or she became tameh lamet. She gets 40 lashes. Now, hechidame, what kind of case is this? If it's a case where her husband did not annul her vow, well, then why do I need to say this? Is anybody, any Nazir, Nazirah? This is just a standard rule that if a Nazir violates the stipulation and drinks wine or becomes tameh lamet, then they get lashes. So ela peshita defer la bala. So it's clear talking about a case where the husband in fact did annul it, and that's the chidush. She gets lashes even though the husband annulled it. Well, let's ask further. Visa kadatech baal mikad akar amay sofeget 40 ela lav shema'mina baal megaz gayiz. And if the husband, when he annuls it, if it works retroactively, so then it turns out she never sinned, even though when she drank the wine, she was a Nazirah, but now afterwards, once he annuls it retroactively, she was never a Nazir, and so therefore the husband can actually undo the sin, and so she shouldn't be given lashes. Rather, it can't be that it works retroactively. It has to work from now on. And that's why, when she drank, she was Nizira. That's why she deserves lashes, even though she doesn't have to continue after the annulment. But everything before the annulment, she is liable for. Seems to be a good proof, but we say no, not necessarily. Le'olam emalach baal mekar akar. ומשום דקתני שפה, הבהר לה בעלה, והיא לא ידעה, והייתה שותה יין ומטמא למתים, אינה סופגת את 40. The continuation of the Mishnah tells us why we said this. Right? In fact, I could explain that it does work retroactively. And it's because of the continuation. If the husband annuls and she didn't know that the husband annulled it, and she drank wine, then she does not get lashes. So we can tell from here, Tanama nameresha sofeget. That's why the first half says that she gets lashes. In other words, we're talking about a case in the first half where the husband did not annul it. All right, and so she became a Nazira, she drank wine, the husband doesn't annul it, she's going to get lashes. That's an obvious case. I know it's obvious, but I want to just set you up for the contrast of the second case. In the second case, from her perspective, it's the same thing. She became a Nazira, and then she sins, and she's drinking. Turns out, without her knowledge, the husband had annulled it. So she is thinking that she made a sin. And anyone looking at her would assume she made a sin, like in the first case. But this makes all the difference because the husband annulled it retroactively. It undoes the whole Nazirut, and that's why she does not get lashes. In the end, this Mishnah can be interpreted in more than one way, and therefore offers no absolute proof. And so we leave it at that, and we'll continue on the next half with 3 more attempted proofs for this challenge. Baruch Adonai L'Olam, Amen v'Amen.